So thank you very much, and thank you very much for the invitation to speak at this important conference. I'm Krystyna Swiderska from IIED, which is the International Institute for Environment and Development, and I've been working on the biocultural heritage of indigenous peoples for some time. So what I'm going to begin by looking at what do we mean by biocultural heritage. Well, this is a fairly new concept. It responds to the separation of nature and culture in Western conservation paradigms, policies, and institutions. For example, protected areas, which are the main mechanism used to protect biodiversity, often exclude indigenous peoples. And we have different and separate conventions dealing with biodiversity conservation and with the conservation of cultural heritage. The biodiversity policies at global and national level do not integrate culture very well. And we have UNESCO policies which do address both cultural heritage and natural heritage, but they also separate these, are led by separate bodies. So this separation of nature and culture actually undermines the effectiveness of conservation responses for both conservation of natural and cultural heritage. For example, protected areas have negatively affected many poor and vulnerable indigenous peoples living around them and their cultural heritage. And at the same time, many protected areas are actually losing biodiversity. So they're not very effective for either conserving natural or cultural heritage. So biocultural heritage recognizes that biological heritage of indigenous peoples, such as their ancestral crop varieties, their traditional landscapes, and their cultural heritage, their intangible heritage like indigenous knowledge, cultural values and beliefs and worldviews, that these two are inextricably linked, and that the crisis of biodiversity loss cannot be effectively addressed without also addressing the crisis of cultural diversity loss, that these two crises are interlinked. You know, for example, languages, indigenous peoples' languages, which are an important indicator of cultural diversity, we're losing over 20 languages per year. So the concept of biocultural heritage is essentially as a response which recognizes that new holistic concepts are needed to bridge these silos and to effectively address both crises. So what evidence do we have of the interlinkages between biodiversity and cultural heritage? There's quite a bit of research on traditional ecological knowledge and adaptive management of indigenous peoples, which shows that the outcomes are supportive for species and ecosystem conservation. And again, that cultural and spiritual values relating to nature and ecosystems support biodiversity conservation. And there's also recent research showing that many of the traditional harvesting practices that have been restricted around protected areas actually contribute to sustainable use of biodiversity. There's also been some global mapping of areas of high biological diversity and high cultural diversity, which has shown a strong geographical overlap between the two. The World Bank has estimated that about 80% of the world's biodiversity is located on the lands of indigenous peoples and local communities. And then recently, the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services concluded that biodiversity is best conserved on the lands of indigenous peoples and local communities. And there have been individual studies showing that cultural diversity is linked to species conservation. For example, this recent study by C4 concludes that conservation of orangutans and other species should not focus on single species, but on maintaining social and natural capital, cultural diversity, and ecological functions. There's also evidence we can find in indigenous peoples' holistic worldviews, which integrate the sacred and natural elements, and their well-being concepts are similarly holistic, and cultural and spiritual values relating to balance and harmony with nature, etc. So just to give a bit of background, We've been working on this concept of biocultural heritage since 2005. IIED and research and Indigenous partners developed a working definition for our research on traditional knowledge, which I'll quickly read out. This definition: knowledge, innovations and practices of Indigenous peoples and local communities which are collectively held and are inextricably linked to traditional resources and territories, local economies, the diversity of genes, species and ecosystems, cultural and spiritual values, and customary laws shaped within the socio-ecological context of communities. And this definition is very much sort of oriented towards the Biodiversity Convention, influencing that policy framework, but it also builds on Indigenous peoples' holistic worldviews. It attempts to bridge biodiversity and cultural heritage and bring them together. It builds on traditional resource rights concept by Daryl Posey and others, and on the UN principles and guidelines for protection of Indigenous peoples' heritage. And through this research, we explored these components, and we identified that these linkages do really exist in not only in the Quechua communities, but in 11 other ethnic groups in 5 countries where this research was conducted, which basically validated those key components and their interlinkages. So this is a simpler way of visualizing biocultural heritage. Important to flag that languages are also key carriers of intangible cultural heritage, not in the diagram. They need to be added. And our research found that there are multiple linkages and interdependencies between the different components. So it's really a complex system. So this is based on our research. Biocultural heritage is very much an evolving concept. Our partner who we've worked with on this concept, Alejandro Argumedo, a Quechua from Peru, recently described biocultural heritage as representing memory, language, history, practices and values, i.e. ways of life, within a particular territory and ecological context. So the heritage aspect is important for reaffirming Indigenous peoples' rights over their traditional territories and resources, because at the moment in the Biodiversity Convention, their rights are only recognized in relation to intangible heritage, to traditional knowledge, but not the related biodiversity resources. And the heritage label also reinforces the responsibility of Indigenous peoples to maintain the heritage for future generations. So it has a conservation angle. And it's a useful framework to bridge silos and to bridge knowledge systems. Okay, so these are the main elements we identified as being core components of biocultural heritage. Language is also a really important component, which isn't currently in this diagram. And we found through our research that there are in fact multiple interlinkages and interdependencies between these. So it's really a complex system. Yeah. So this work on biocultural heritage that we've done is really still work in progress. It's an evolving concept. Our partner, Indigenous Quechua partner, Alejandro Argumedo, recently described biocultural heritage as represents memory, language, history, practices and values, i.e. ways of life, within a particular territory and ecological context. So that the heritage term, it reinforces people's rights over their territories and biological resources, and their responsibility to maintain the heritage for future generations. So it's a useful framework to bridge silos and bridge knowledge systems, Western and Indigenous ways of knowing. But biocultural heritage itself is a framework concept. It's not a substitute for Indigenous people's own concepts, like sumak kausai, or holistic well-being of Quechua people, and the Ailu concept, which essentially means that well-being depends on balance and reciprocity between the human and domesticated world, the wild animals and plants, and the sacred world. These 3 worlds need to be in balance to achieve well-being. So these concepts are also really important to keep studying and supporting. So how does biocultural heritage contribute to sustainable development goals? There are many contributions to different goals. I've talked already about how it contributes to biodiversity conservation, SDG 15, SDG 2, end hunger, indigenous crops, indigenous food systems, sustain a really rich diversity of crops and different livestock varieties, which are often very resilient to climate change. They sustain agroecological practices and are often a high degree of self-sufficiency, which makes them highly resilient to shocks such as COVID. There's a clear link contribution to ending poverty. Biocultural heritage provides opportunities for income generation from products and services such as traditional foods, crafts, natural products, ecotourism, and it also provides values to shape sustainable and equitable economic systems. There are clear linkages with SDG 13, climate action, with SDG 3, health and well-being, with SDG 10, reduced inequalities, and with SDG 16, peace and strong institutions. But there is no SDG dealing specifically with culture or traditional knowledge, which I think is a big gap. So we've been addressing biocultural heritage in practice through support for biocultural heritage territories, which we've defined as land use mosaics encompassing indigenous and traditional land tenure, production and exchange systems, cultural identity, community organization, and simultaneous goals of endogenous development and biodiversity conservation. So essentially, these territories arise from indigenous peoples' own territorial concepts and memories and lived experiences. They're guided by indigenous holistic well-being concepts as a goal rather than by conservation goals, and they address multiple SDGs. They aim to strengthen indigenous exchange systems, ritual culture, and the co-evolution of land and culture from pre-colonial times. They're very much a vernacular, bottom-up and food-centered approach where decolonizing participatory action, research and indigenous methods and tools play a key role. So to give an example, the Potato Park Biocultural Heritage Territory in Cusco, Peru, is a large area, 9,600 hectares, governed by 5 Quechua communities based on their customary laws and beliefs. It conserves about 1,400 native potato varieties, which is about 650 based on Western science, 650 varieties, different varieties. It's a micro-center of potato origin that provides a really important evolving gene bank for climate adaptation and food security. It also conserves a great diversity of Andean crops and wildlife through sacred sites and beliefs. And I've just been told that I need to wrap up, so I will go to the next slide on the challenges for biocultural heritage and sustainable development. One challenge is how to promote biocultural heritage territories in other contexts where culture has been eroded. For example, in African and Asian contexts, it's more difficult than in Latin American contexts. There is a real need to integrate culture better within conservation programs. Currently, the focus is very much on market incentives, which can undermine culture and cultural incentives. And also, the challenges within development and agriculture sectors that tend to view traditional knowledge and traditional crops as old and really prioritize a focus on modernization and markets. What we need for sustainable development is much stronger investment on traditional knowledge-based solutions that address multiple goals and traditional knowledge and science linkages. And we also need to look at the narratives and political economy that maintain these exclusive conservation and modernization policies. So recommendations to finish, some ideas for heritage research. There's certainly a need for more exploration of the linkages between different elements of biodiversity and cultural heritage at local level, and more research on indigenous holistic concepts that make these linkages. particularly in Asian and African contexts. In relation to policy, there is the post-2020 targets of the Biodiversity Convention, and there's a need to better link this research to better integrate culture within those targets, to promote a more bottom-up approach to cultural landscapes which integrate nature and culture, but aren't always very driven by communities, and a need to increase awareness of these terms like biocultural heritage, which can be used to bridge silos. Within the agriculture sectors, there's definitely need for much more research on indigenous food systems and crops, and more support for participatory breeding approaches. And I think my last point will be to stress that for heritage research, I think there's a real need to focus on decolonizing participatory action research methods that empower indigenous peoples to be able to stem the loss of their biocultural heritage. So moving from co-production of knowledge to indigenous leadership and reconsidering the role of academics in that. It's more about supporting, providing methodological options, and providing literature reviews, providing links with policy, maybe taking more of a backseat. Okay, so just my last slide. Thank you very much. If you're interested, all our work is on this website, Biocultural Heritage. And if you're interested in a workshop in October on these issues, please do get in touch. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Krystyna, and sorry that we lost you briefly. So we are running a bit late, and I might actually cancel the break so we can swiftly go on. But there is just one question that came forward is the IIED currently working or planning to work with communities in the South Pacific whose biocultural diversity is already rapidly being lost due to the impact of the climate crisis?
Well, that's a very good question. South Pacific is a very important area because of the strength of customary laws in the governance there. But no, we're not currently working in the South Pacific. I think it would be great to do some work on biocultural heritage in that area. As you say, the climate change challenges make this, a particularly pressing area to work on. So thanks for raising that.